Now let's start in event.go in this save method here with storing data in the database. And for that, we can prepare another SQL query as a string, and this time it's an insert into statement that should be executed to insert some data into the database. For that, we have to target the table where the data should be inserted, events in this case, and then between parentheses, the different fields into which values should be inserted. In this case, the name, description, location, date time, and user ID field. Thereafter, you add the values keyword to then define the values that should go into these different columns. Now I'll actually switch to the backtick notation again, so that I can split this across multiple lines to make it a bit easier to read. So that we can write this query like this. After values, we again add a pair of parentheses, and then we define all the values that go into these different columns. Therefore here we could type something like test if we would want to use test as a name for that event, but of course we want to use the actual data that we're getting from the request instead of hard coding something here. And to inject that received data in a safe way into this query, which is not vulnerable to SQL injection attacks, we should add a couple of question marks here. One for every column into which a value should be inserted. So 5 question marks in total here. Because that's a special syntax that is supported by these SQL packages that gives us a SQL injection safe way of inserting values into this query. Because we do now insert the actual values by using our DB package again. Of course, you therefore must import it. And then there, the database, and then the prepare method. To prepare, we pass our query, and as a result, we'll get the prepared SQL statement or an error if something goes wrong. Now, it will still not contain the values yet, but we'll take care about that soon. First, we should check if we got some error when we try to prepare this statement, for example, because it contains some error, that statement. In that case, here in save, I want to return that error so that we can handle it in the place where we call save. Hence, the return type of save should be error. If we make it past this if check though, we got no error, and we then got this prepared statement. And we can then use this prepared statement to execute it with this exec method which exists on this statement value. And to exec, we now can pass as many arguments as we need, one for every placeholder we have here. So one for every question mark, in the order in which those values should be assigned to those columns. So here we now pass in our event name as a first value, so that this is used as a value for this question mark, and therefore as a value for name in the end. Then we have the description, the location, the date time, and the user ID. And that's now how those values will be inserted into this SQL statement in a safe way, protected against SQL injection attacks, and how that statement will then be executed to actually insert the data into the database. Now exec will return such a SQL result or an error, and here I'm interested in both, so I get my result or the error. And I first check if the error is not nil, in which case I want to return it so that we can handle it in the place where we called save, like this. Otherwise, past this if check, we know that everything worked, and then we can use this result to call last inserted ID to get that ID of that event that was inserted. Because remember that we actually configured this table such that the ID is set automatically. And we can get this automatically generated ID with help of this last insert ID function here. So as a result, we get back the ID or an error if this somehow fails, if no ID was found. And I want to use that ID to set it on my event. So I'll set the event ID to ID. So to this ID I got back here. Now one problem we'll face here is that this ID is actually of type int64, which is a more specific type of int. And to make sure that everything works, we therefore have to change our ID on that event struct to int64 as well. With that, we can assign this, and we can get rid of this line of code here, because I'm no longer managing my events as a local slice in this file. And instead, I'll now just return this error here if we got any. One last thing we also should do with that statement is close it after we executed it. And a good way of doing that is with help of the defer keyword about which you learned, which allows us to call close here without executing it here. Instead, it will be executed by Go now whenever this save function is done, no matter if it's done because we had an error here or because it completed successfully. That's how we should close the statement. Well, and with that, new events will be inserted into the database. Now, of course, it would also be nice to fetch them from there. And that's what we'll do in getAllEvents.